The morning sun crept across the weathered concrete floor of Reed's classic auto restoration, illuminating decades of oil stains like a roadmap of memories. Thomas Reed's calloused hands moved with surgical precision over the engine block of a 1967 Mustang Fastback, the kind of American muscle that had defined an era. A radio in the corner played softly some financial report about airline fuel costs and corporate mergers that Thomas barely registered. "Dad, is this right?" Thomas glanced up from the engine. His daughter Sophie sat at a small desk in the corner, her math homework spread before her, dark hair falling across her face in the same way her mother's once had. At 8 years old, she already possessed a quiet intensity that sometimes made Thomas's heart ache. "Let me see, kiddo." He wiped his hands on a shop rag that had long ago surrendered to permanent stains and crossed the garage. The morning light caught the glass case on the far wall, a modest display that most customers never noticed. Inside, three model aircraft meticulously assembled, a distinguished flying cross medal in a shadow box, and a faded photograph of a much younger Thomas standing beside Neil Armstrong, both in NASA windbreakers. Sophie's pencil tapped against a fraction problem. "Mrs. Dawson says there's an easier way, but I forgot." Thomas crouched beside her. "Remember what I always say about engineering?" She rolled her eyes but smiled. "The simplest solution is usually the best one." "That's my girl." The heavy metal door swung open with a familiar creak, admitting a tall, slightly stooped figure. Walter Harrington moved with the deliberate gait of someone whose mind remained sharper than his knees. At 68, his hair had gone silver, decades ago, but his eyes still held the same calculating intelligence that had once helped guide men to the moon. "Morning, Thomas." Walter set a paper bag on the workbench. "Brought you some of Margaret's sourdough. Started a new batch using that 1950s technique I was telling you about." Thomas nodded appreciatively. Walter's late wife had been renowned for her bread, and in the years since her passing, he'd taken up the craft with scientific precision. "And how's my favorite assistant engineer today?" Walter asked, turning to Sophie. "Fractions," she replied with dramatic gravity. "Ah." Walter's eyes twinkled. "The building blocks of the universe. I once had to recalculate an entire guidance system because someone rounded a fraction. Nearly sent Apollo 13 to Venus instead of the moon." Sophie giggled. It wasn't true, of course, but Walter's exaggerated stories of his NASA days always delighted her. Thomas watched their interaction with quiet gratitude. After Margaret's death, after everything fell apart, Walter had appeared like some guardian angel in oil-stained clothes, offering not just friendship, but a bridge to the man Thomas used to be. Now the old engineer was practically family. "Brought in the carburetor from the '63 Corvette," Walter said, setting down a greasy paper-wrapped package. "Fuel mixture's still running rich." Thomas nodded. "I'll take a look at it this afternoon." The garage phone rang, an actual landline that Thomas kept because he didn't trust cell reception in the metal-walled building. As he answered, his eyes instinctively drifted to the wall calendar. April 17th, 8 years to the day since Pinnacle Flight 520 fell from the sky. 8 years since Margaret didn't come home. 40 minutes later, Thomas walked alongside Sophie toward her elementary school, the morning commuter rush of Oakland flowing around them like a river around stones. The air carried the crisp promise of spring, though the Bay Area fog still lingered in patches. "And then Joey said his dad's Tesla could drive itself, but I told him your Mustang was cooler because it sounds like a dragon when you start it." Sophie was saying, her backpack bouncing slightly with each step. Thomas smiled. "That's my girl, always standing up for the classics. Dad, why don't you ever fly anymore?" The question came abruptly, as Sophie's questions often did, unexpected turns in conversation that sometimes left Thomas breathless. He kept his face neutral. "I told you, Soph, I like keeping my feet on the ground these days. But Walter said you were the best pilot he ever knew, even better than the astronauts." Thomas chuckled despite himself. "Walter exaggerates." "Mom flew," Sophie said quietly. "I remember watching her leave for the airport. She always wore her blue uniform, and that special pin with wings." Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "She loved it more than anything." "More than us?" Sophie asked, her eyes suddenly worried. Thomas stopped walking, kneeling to meet her gaze. "No, Soph, never more than us. She just loved sharing the sky with people, taking them places they needed to go." Sophie seemed to consider this, her small face serious. I think I might want to fly someday too. Before Thomas could respond, a sound like distant thunder rolled down the street, metal grinding against metal. His head snapped up, combat-honed instincts suddenly electric in his veins. Half a block ahead, a massive container truck was careening down the hill, its horn blaring in desperate warning bursts. The driver's door hung open, no one at the wheel. People scattered from crosswalks, a cacophony of screams and screeching tires filling the air. Then Thomas saw her, a woman in a tailored charcoal suit, absorbed in an intense phone conversation, standing directly in the truck's path, oblivious to the approaching danger. "Sophie, stay here. Do not move," Thomas commanded, already sprinting forward. Time compressed, his mind calculated trajectory and speed, with the same precision he had once used to land damaged aircraft on pitching carrier decks. The woman finally looked up, her expression shifting from annoyance to dawning horror as the runaway truck bore down on her. Thomas hit her at a controlled angle, one arm wrapping around her waist as his momentum carried them both clear of the truck's path. They tumbled onto the sidewalk as the massive vehicle thundered past, missing them by inches before crashing into a row of parked cars with a deafening impact. For a moment, they lay tangled on the concrete, the woman half beneath him. Thomas immediately pushed himself up, his military training kicking in as he scanned her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The woman stared up at him, momentarily speechless. Her dark hair had come partially loose from its elegant twist, and her ice-blue eyes were wide with shock. She was perhaps in her late 30s with the kind of features that commanded attention even in crisis. I think I'm okay." She managed, her voice cultured and controlled despite the circumstances. Thomas stood offering his hand. She took it, rising with surprising grace given what had just happened. Her suit, clearly expensive, was now streaked with dust and grime. "You just saved my life," she said, the reality of the near miss settling in. Thomas shrugged uncomfortably. "Right place, right time." "Dad," Sophie's voice cut through the chaos as she ran toward him, ignoring his earlier command. "Sophie." Thomas crouched, catching her in a tight embrace. "I told you to stay put." "I was scared," she admitted, burying her face against his shoulder before peeking up at the woman. "Are you okay, ma'am?" The woman's expression softened as she looked at Sophie. "Thanks to your father, yes." A man in an impeccable suit pushed through the gathering crowd. "Ms. Mitchell, are you all right? I saw what happened." "I'm fine, James," she replied, though her eyes remained fixed on Thomas. Thomas felt a jolt of recognition at the name. Eleanor Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Aerospace and Innovation. Her face occasionally appeared in the engineering journals he still couldn't bring himself to cancel. "We should get you checked by paramedics," her assistant was saying, gesturing to the approaching emergency vehicles. "What's your name?" Eleanor Mitchell asked Thomas, ignoring her assistant. Thomas hesitated, in old wariness rising. "Thomas? Thomas Reed." "Mr. Reed, I owe you nothing." Thomas cut her off, taking Sophie's hand. "You don't owe me anything." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, pulling Sophie gently but firmly through the crowd. Behind them, camera phones were already raised, recording the aftermath. Thomas kept his head down, face averted. "Dad?" Sophie asked as they rounded the corner. "Yes, sweetheart." "Was that lady important?" Thomas glanced back once, catching a final glimpse of Eleanor Mitchell standing amid the chaos, still watching him. "Everyone's important, Soph," he answered quietly. "Now let's get you to school." 3 days later, Thomas was replacing a timing belt on a Dodge Charger when Walter appeared at his elbow, clearing his throat with dramatic emphasis. "There's someone here to see you," Walter announced, his tone suspiciously casual. Thomas didn't look up. "If it's another reporter, tell them I'm not interested." "It's not a reporter," Walter replied, "unless CEOs have started moonlighting in journalism." Thomas straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his shop rag as he turned toward the garage entrance. Eleanor Mitchell stood just inside the doorway, dressed more casually than before in tailored slacks and a simple blue blouse, though still radiating an aura of authority that seemed at odds with the humble surroundings. "Ms. Mitchell," Thomas said evenly, "if you're looking for your Mercedes, we don't service anything newer than 1979. A hint of a smile crossed her face. "My car's fine, thank you. I'm here to see you, Mr. Reed." Thomas glanced at Walter, who was making a poor show of pretending to organize a nearby toolbox while obviously eavesdropping. Sophie sat at her homework table, watching the exchange with undisguised curiosity. I'm in the middle of a pun, Thomas said. Eleanor took a step closer, undeterred. I've been trying to thank you properly for 3 days. You disappeared rather quickly after saving my life. You already thanked me. We're even. She studied him, her head tilting slightly. You know who I am? It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway. Eleanor Mitchell, Mitchell Aerospace and Innovation, one of the few private aviation companies actually innovating instead of just cutting costs. Something flickered in her eyes, surprised perhaps that a mechanic would know such details. I'd like to buy you lunch, she said, to express my gratitude properly. That's not necessary. I insist. Thomas's jaw tightened. Mrs. Mitchell, people like you don't have lunch with people like me unless you want something. So why don't we skip the niceties and you can tell me what you're really after? Walter coughed pointedly from his position by the toolbox. Sophie's eyes widened at her father's bluntness. If Eleanor was offended, she didn't show it. Instead, she reached into her bag and withdrew a folded document which she placed on the workbench. I was on my way to present our new LEAP-X engine design when the incident occurred, she said. The prototype uses a titanium graphene composite for the turbine blades. It's supposed to increase thermal efficiency by 40% while reducing weight. Thomas didn't touch the document. And when I returned to the office, I discovered something interesting about you, Mr. Reed. She maintained steady eye contact. Former Lieutenant Commander Thomas Reed, naval aviator with over 3,000 flight hours, engineering degree from Cal Poly. 8 years as lead thermal dynamics engineer at Pinnacle Aviation. Thomas's expression hardened. You had me investigated. I had you Googled, she corrected. The rest wasn't hard to piece together, especially since the video of you saving me went viral. Thomas looked away, his jaw working. Well, now you know. I used to build planes. Now I fix cars. Mystery solved. What I can't figure out, Eleanor continued undeterred, is why someone with your qualifications is hiding in an auto garage. I'm not hiding, Thomas replied, an edge entering his voice. I'm living. There's a difference. Sophie had abandoned any pretense of doing homework and was watching the exchange with rapt attention. Walter, too, had given up his charade of busy work. Eleanor's gaze softened slightly. Mr. Reed, I'm not here to disrupt your life, but Mitchell Aerospace is developing new propulsion systems that could revolutionize commercial aviation. I could use someone with your experience as a consultant. Thomas laughed, a short, harsh sound devoid of humor. I'm out of that world for a reason, Ms. Mitchell. What reason? The question hung in the air between them. Thomas felt Sophie and Walter watching him, felt the weight of 8 years pressing down. Dad doesn't like to talk about before, Sophie said, suddenly sliding off her stool and moving to stand beside Thomas. Her small hand found his squeezing gently. Eleanor looked at Sophie, then back to Thomas, something like understanding dawning in her eyes. I see. She nodded slowly. Well, my offer stands, and so does lunch, no strings attached. She placed a business card next to the folded document. Call me if you change your mind. As she turned to leave, Thomas found himself speaking. The composite. Eleanor paused, looking back. Excuse me. Your titanium graphene composite. At high altitudes, the differential cooling rates between the materials will create microfractures along the bond lines. Your 40% efficiency gain will disappear after about 300 flight hours, and you'll have blade integrity issues after 1,000. Eleanor stared at him, clearly reassessing everything about the man before her. How could you possibly know that without seeing the specifications? Thomas shrugged. Physics doesn't change, Ms. Mitchell, no matter how good your engineers are. A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face. Have dinner with me tonight, Mr. Reed. Bring your daughter. I promise not to talk business, just to thank you, one human being to another. Thomas felt Sophie's hand tighten around his own, a silent plea. Fine, he conceded reluctantly, but nothing fancy. There's a diner 3 blocks east that makes a decent burger. Perfect, Eleanor replied, seemingly unfazed by the modest suggestion. 7 o'clock. Thomas nodded once, already wondering if he'd regret this decision. 7 it is. She turned to Sophie with a warm smile. It was nice meeting you properly. Sophie, the girl supplied with a shy smile. Sophie, Eleanor repeated. Beautiful name. After she left, Walter let out a low whistle. Well, that was something. Thomas shot him a warning look, but Walter merely chuckled, returning to the Corvette carburetor he'd been rebuilding. Sophie returned to her homework table, but not before giving her father a look that clearly said, "I'm proud of you." Thomas turned back to the Charger's engine bay, but his mind was elsewhere, caught between the past he'd tried to bury and a present that suddenly felt less certain than it had an hour ago. The diner was a throwback to another era: red vinyl booths, chrome-edged tables, and a jukebox that still played actual 45s. Thomas and Sophie arrived 5 minutes early, Sophie wearing her nicest dress and Thomas in clean jeans and the one button-down shirt he owned that wasn't stained with motor oil. Eleanor Mitchell arrived precisely at 7, having exchanged her business attire for dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Thomas's monthly rent. Several patrons glanced up, clearly recognizing her despite the casual setting. "You came," Thomas observed as she slid into the booth opposite him and Sophie. "I said I would." Her smile was genuine. "This place has character." "Best milkshakes in Oakland," Sophie announced, already eyeing the dessert menu. "Is that a recommendation?" Eleanor asked her. Sophie nodded solemnly. "Chocolate with extra whipped cream." "Sounds perfect." They ordered burgers for Thomas and Eleanor, chicken fingers for Sophie, and milkshakes all around. As promised, Eleanor didn't mention business. Instead, she asked Sophie about school, listened with genuine interest to stories about Sophie's friends and her science project on renewable energy. "Did your dad help with that?" Eleanor asked, something knowing in her smile. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "He built a real mini wind turbine that actually works. Mrs. Dawson said it was the best project she'd ever seen." Thomas looked slightly embarrassed. "It wasn't that complicated." "It had lights and everything," Sophie insisted, loyalty fierce in her voice. Eleanor watched their interaction with a thoughtful expression. As the meal progressed, Thomas found himself relaxing marginally. Eleanor was surprisingly easy to talk to when she wasn't being CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. She had a quick wit and listened more than she spoke, a rarity in Thomas's experience with executives. After Sophie had demolished her chocolate milkshake and excused herself to examine the jukebox, Eleanor's expression turned more serious. "I wasn't entirely truthful earlier," she admitted. "I did look into your background more thoroughly than a simple Google search." Thomas tensed. "Why?" "Because I couldn't understand why someone would walk away from a brilliant career. Then I found the connection to Pinnacle Flight 520. Her voice softened. "I'm sorry about your wife." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Don't." "Thomas, I don't talk about that. Not with strangers, not with anyone." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Fair enough. But I did see the safety reports you filed before the crash. The warnings about the thermal shielding issues." Thomas stared at her, his expression suddenly guarded. "How did you get access to those? They were buried in the investigation." "Well, I have resources," she replied simply. "The point is, you tried to prevent that tragedy. You did everything right." Thomas looked away, watching Sophie as she carefully selected a song on the jukebox. The opening notes of "Fly Me to the Moon" drifted across the diner. The irony wasn't lost on him. "It wasn't enough," he said finally, his voice low. 58 people died, including my wife, because Pinnacle cared more about their production schedule than passenger safety." Eleanor leaned forward. "That's exactly why Mitchell Aerospace needs people like you. We're building something different: aircraft designed with safety as the cornerstone, not an afterthought." Thomas shook his head. "I told you I'm out of that world." "Why, because you couldn't save them then." His eyes snapped to hers, anger flashing. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know that hiding your gifts in an auto garage won't bring them back," she said gently. "And I know that your expertise could prevent other families from experiencing what you and Sophie did." Before Thomas could respond, Sophie returned to the table, beaming with pride at her musical selection. "Mom and Dad danced to this at their wedding," she announced. "Walter showed me the pictures." Thomas's expression softened immediately. "That's right, kiddo. Good memory." Eleanor watched the transformation with interest. When Sophie became absorbed in the dessert menu again, she spoke softly. "Just think about it, Thomas. That's all I'm asking." Later, as they stood outside the diner preparing to part ways, Sophie surprised everyone by giving Eleanor a spontaneous hug. "Thank you for the milkshake," she said earnestly. Eleanor seemed momentarily startled, before returning the embrace. "You're very welcome, Sophie." Thomas watched the interaction with a complex emotion he couldn't quite name. When Eleanor looked up at him, something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of one. "Good night, Thomas," she said. "Good night, Eleanor." As he watched her walk to the sleek town car waiting at the curb, Thomas felt as though something fundamental had shifted. 8 years of carefully constructed isolation had developed its first crack. A week later, Thomas found himself in an unfamiliar position, standing in the lobby of Mitchell Aerospace headquarters in downtown San Francisco, a visitor badge clipped to his shirt. The building was all glass and steel modern, without being ostentatious, with models of historic and cutting-edge aircraft suspended from the ceiling. Walter had practically shoved him out the door that morning. "You've been rebuilding other people's machines for 8 years, the older man had said. "Maybe it's time to build something of your own again." Now, as an assistant led him through security toward the elevator, Thomas tried to ignore the anxiety pooling in his stomach. He hadn't set foot in an aerospace facility since the day he'd been escorted from Pinnacle's offices. His security clearance revoked his career in ruins. The elevator opened directly into a vast engineering floor, an open concept space filled with workstations, 3D printers, and glass-walled testing rooms. Staff in casual attire moved purposefully between areas, the atmosphere more reminiscent of a university research lab than a corporate office. Eleanor Mitchell waited near a central conference area, dressed in a simple black dress that somehow conveyed authority without ostentation. She smiled when she saw him. "You came," she said, echoing his words from the diner. "Just to look," Thomas clarified. "I haven't agreed to anything." She nodded. "Of course. Follow me." As they walked through the engineering floor, Thomas couldn't help but notice the differences from Pinnacle's rigid, compartmentalized approach. Here, test pilots chatted with materials engineers. Software developers collaborated openly with aerodynamics experts. "Our philosophy is integration," Eleanor explained, noting his observations. "No silos, no bureaucratic walls between departments. Everyone understands how their work affects the whole." She led him to a glass-walled conference room where digital schematics glowed on multiple screens. At the center was a detailed rendering of what appeared to be a revolutionary turbofan engine design. "The Leap X," Eleanor said. "Our next-generation propulsion system, designed to be 40% more efficient than current models while reducing emissions by 60%. Thomas approached the screens, his practiced eye immediately assessing the design. Despite himself, he was impressed. The engineering was elegant, innovative, without being reckless. "You took my advice about the composite," he noted, zooming in on the turbine blade specifications. Eleanor nodded. "Our team recalculated the thermal properties based on your observations. You were right, we would have had catastrophic blade failure around the 1,000-hour mark." Thomas continued examining the design, asking occasionally for clarification on specific elements. He'd expected to feel out of place rusty after 8 years away from the industry. Instead, it was like slipping into a familiar language, one his mind had never truly forgotten. "It's good work," he admitted finally, "but I still don't understand why you want me involved. You clearly have talented people." Eleanor gestured for him to sit. Once they were both seated at the conference table, she pressed a button that frosted the glass walls, ensuring privacy. "Because talent isn't enough, Thomas. We need people who understand what's at stake." She met his gaze directly. "After you left that day, I did more research. I found out who was responsible for suppressing your safety concerns at Pinnacle." Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Robert Vance, safety director." "Former safety director," Eleanor corrected. "Currently executive vice president at Westland Defense Systems." Thomas's jaw tightened. "What does that have to do with Mitchell Aerospace?" Eleanor slid a tablet across the table. On it was a contract bearing the logos of both Mitchell Aerospace and Westland Defense Systems. "Westland is our primary investor and component supplier for the Leap X project," she said quietly. "Robert Vance personally oversees the partnership." Thomas stared at the document, then at Eleanor, disbelief and anger warring in his expression. "You brought me here knowing that," his voice was dangerously calm. "Was this some kind of sick test?" "No," Eleanor replied firmly. "I brought you here because I discovered this connection 3 days ago, and it concerns me deeply. A man who buried safety concerns once could do it again. So what do you want from me? Revenge. Thomas stood abruptly. I buried that part of my life for a reason, Ms. Mitchell. Did you, Eleanor, challenge standing as well? Or did you just build a different kind of cockpit to hide in one where the only person who could get hurt was you? The words hit with precision, leaving Thomas momentarily speechless. I want your expertise, Eleanor continued, her voice softening. But more than that, I want your integrity. The kind that made you file those reports even when you knew it might cost you your career. Thomas shook his head. It cost me far more than my career. I know, Eleanor acknowledged, and nothing can change that. But you have a chance here to make sure it never happens again. Not on my watch, not at my company. Thomas turned away, staring at the engine schematics still glowing on the screens. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine being part of something like this, again, building, creating, protecting. I need to think about it, he said finally. Eleanor nodded. Of course, take all the time you need. As Thomas turned to leave, she added, there's something else you should know. Robert Vance is visiting our facilities next week to review the LeapX progress. Thomas paused at the door. Is that supposed to convince me? No, Eleanor replied. It's just the truth. And I thought you'd appreciate that after everything you've been through. Thomas left without responding, the weight of the past and the pull of possibility creating a turbulence he hadn't felt in years. That night, Thomas sat on the small porch of the modest craftsman home he and Sophie had moved into after selling the house he'd once shared with Margaret. The neighborhood was quiet, middle class, the kind of place where people recognized each other but generally respected privacy. Sophie was already asleep inside her school project materials spread across the kitchen table for the science fair tomorrow. Thomas nursed a beer, watching the fog roll in across the Oakland Hills. The sound of an old engine announced Walter's arrival before his restored 1965 Ford pickup appeared at the curb. The older man climbed out carrying a paper bag that undoubtedly contained more of his experimental sourdough. Didn't expect to see you tonight, Thomas said as Walter settled into the adjacent deck chair. Figured you might need to talk after your venture into the lion's den, Walter replied, setting the bread on the small table between them. How was it? Thomas took a long pull from his beer before answering. It was familiar, in ways I didn't expect. Walter nodded, understanding in his weathered features. The smell of it, right, that combination of metal and possibility, gets in your blood. It's not that simple, Walt. Never said it was. Walter stretched his long legs out before him. You going to tell me what's really bothering you, or do I have to guess? Thomas stared out at the darkening sky. Robert Vance is involved with Mitchell Aerospace. He's a VP at their primary investor. Walter let out a low whistle. The same Vance who buried your safety reports at Pinnacle. The very same. Well, that's a hell of a coincidence. Thomas shook his head. Eleanor Mitchell doesn't think it's a coincidence. She thinks it's a reason for concern. Smart woman, Walter observed. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Thomas turned to look at his friend. What would you do? Walter considered this, his eyes reflecting decades of experience. When I was at NASA, we had a saying, in God we trust, all others bring data. After Apollo 1, when those 3 good men died in that capsule fire, we learned the hard way that safety warnings aren't suggestions, they're obligations. He paused, memories clouding his features. I lost friends because someone decided the schedule was more important than safety. Sound familiar? Thomas nodded grimly. You can't bring Margaret back, Walter continued gently. God knows I understand that pain, but you can make sure her death wasn't for nothing, that the system that failed her doesn't fail someone else's wife, someone else's mother. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of memory settling between them like an old familiar guest. Sophie asked about her again tonight, Thomas said finally. Wanted to know if Margaret was scared at the end. Walter's expression softened. What did you tell her? The truth, that her mother was the bravest person I ever knew, and that if anyone on that plane was keeping others calm in those final moments, it would have been her. That sounds right, Walter agreed. Margaret always had steel in her spine. Thomas smiled faintly at the memory. She's the one who encouraged me to file those reports, you know, even when I worried about the professional consequences. Sounds like Eleanor Mitchell has a bit of Margaret in her, Walter observed carefully. Thomas shot him a warning look. Don't! Walter raised his hands in surrender. Just an observation. Another silence felt more comfortable than the last. If I do this, Thomas said eventually, if I step back into that world, I need to know Sophie will be okay, that I won't be dragging her into some corporate war that could blow up in our faces. Walter nodded seriously. You know I'm always here for both of you. But Thomas, have you considered that maybe Sophie needs to see her father fight for something again? Not just survive, but really live. The question hung in the night air, unanswered, but not dismissed. Later, after Walter had gone, Thomas found himself standing in front of the small shrine he'd created in the hallway photos of Margaret throughout their life together. Her academy graduation, their wedding day. Margaret in her flight uniform standing proudly before her first commercial aircraft. What would you do, Meg? He whispered to the silent photographs. What would you want me to do? No answer came, of course. But as Thomas finally turned away, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years, the faint but unmistakable stirring of purpose. The next morning, he called Eleanor Mitchell. I'll look at your engine designs, he said when she answered, but I'm not making any promises beyond that. He could hear the smile in her voice. That's all I'm asking for, Thomas, a chance to show you what we're building. And if I find problems, then we fix them, she replied without hesitation. No matter what it costs, no matter who objects, you have my word. After hanging up, Thomas stood in his kitchen for a long moment, feeling as though he'd just initiated a descent into territory he'd sworn never to enter again. Whether it would end in a safe landing or another crash, only time would tell. But for the first time in 8 years, Thomas Reed was willing to take the risk. 2 days later, Thomas sat in Mitchell Aerospace's main engineering lab, surrounded by technical specifications and computer models. He'd been given full access to the LeapX project files along with a private workspace where he could review them undisturbed. The design was impressive, revolutionary even. But as Thomas delved deeper into the thermal management systems, a familiar unease began to build. There, buried in the test data from high-altitude simulations, was a pattern he recognized all too well. Under specific conditions, the kind of rare but inevitable scenarios that commercial aircraft eventually encounter, the innovative cooling system would experience a cascade failure. The very efficiency that made the design groundbreaking also created its fatal flaw. It was Pinnacle all over again. Different materials, different approach, same potential outcome. Thomas sat back, rubbing his eyes. The Mitchell engineers had missed it just as Pinnacles had 8 years ago. Not through incompetence, but through the natural optimism that drives innovation, the desire to believe your creation will perform as intended. He was still staring at the screen when Eleanor entered, 2 cups of coffee in hand. You've been at it for 10 hours straight, she observed, setting 1 cup beside him. Find anything interesting? Thomas looked up at her, weighing his words carefully. Your cooling system has a critical flaw under specific flight conditions. To her credit, Eleanor didn't dismiss him or become defensive. Instead, she pulled up a chair. Show me. For the next hour, Thomas walked her through his findings, explaining the complex thermodynamics in terms a non-engineer could understand. He showed her the simulation models, the stress tests, the failure points that appeared only when multiple uncommon factors aligned. Under normal conditions, you'd never see it, he explained. But commercial aviation isn't about normal conditions. It's about being prepared for the worst possible scenario. Eleanor listened intently, asking occasional clarifying questions but never challenging his assessment. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. How long would it take to redesign? She finally asked. The cooling system, 3 months minimum. You'd need to rework the entire thermal management approach, which would delay the prototype by at least 6 months. Thomas nodded. Probably. Eleanor stood pacing the small workspace. Westland is expecting a demonstration for the Defense Department in 4 months. Robert Vance has staked his reputation on our delivery timeline. I can't tell you what to do, Thomas said. I can only tell you what I found. Eleanor stopped pacing, turning to face him with an expression of grim determination. I didn't bring you here to ignore your findings, Thomas. If you say there's a problem, we fix it. Period. Relief washed through him, an emotion so unexpected it almost made him dizzy. How long had it been since someone in authority had simply believed him? Vance won't accept the delay without a fight, he warned. Then we'll show him the data, Eleanor replied. If he's truly concerned with safety— He's not, Thomas interrupted flatly. He's concerned with contracts, timelines, and his reputation. Trust me, I've dealt with him before. Eleanor studied him. Then we'll have to be prepared for that fight. As if summoned by their conversation, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, her expression darkening. Speaking of which, she said, Robert Vance just moved up his site visit. He'll be here tomorrow morning. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. I should go. Why? Eleanor challenged. You found a critical safety issue. You should be part of the discussion. Vance and I have history. My presence will only complicate things. Eleanor stepped closer, her gaze intent. Thomas, I didn't bring you here to hide you away. I brought you because I trust your expertise and your integrity. I need both tomorrow. Thomas hesitated, the weight of the past pressing down on him. I haven't confronted him since the crash, since the investigation cleared Pinnacle of wrongdoing. Understanding softened Eleanor's features. I know I'm asking a lot, but this isn't just about the past anymore. It's about making sure history doesn't repeat itself. The words echoed those he'd spoken to Pinnacle executives 8 years ago before they had dismissed his concerns and cleared the P-520 for passenger service, before Margaret had boarded it for what should have been a routine flight. All right, Thomas said finally. I'll be here, but don't expect miracles. Eleanor's smile held both gratitude and something deeper, a recognition of the courage this decision required. Thank you, she said simply. As Thomas gathered his things to leave, his phone rang. Sophie's school. His heart immediately raced with parental concern. Mr. Reed, came the principal's voice. Sophie's fine, but there's been an incident. She got into an altercation with another student. We need you to come in. 20 minutes later, Thomas sat in the principal's office beside a subdued Sophie, listening as Mrs. Hargrove explained the situation. Sophie punched another student, Joey Clemens, after he made comments about the video of you saving Ms. Mitchell. Apparently, it's been circulating online again after a news story about Mitchell Aerospace. Thomas glanced at Sophie, whose eyes remained fixed on her hands in her lap. What exactly did Joey say? Thomas asked. Mrs. Hargrove hesitated. He suggested that you were pursuing Ms. Mitchell for her money. He used less appropriate terminology. Thomas felt a surge of protective anger, quickly tempered by the knowledge that Sophie had resorted to violence. I understand hitting isn't the answer, he said carefully, but it sounds like Joey was being deliberately hurtful. Be that as it may, Mr. Reed, we have a zero-tolerance policy for physical aggression. Sophie will need to serve detention tomorrow afternoon. After a few more minutes of discussion, they were dismissed. The walk to the car was silent, Sophie trailing a few steps behind Thomas, clearly expecting a lecture. Instead, when they reached the car, Thomas crouched to meet her at eye level. Want to tell me what really happened? Sophie's eyes welled with tears. Joey said you were only helping that lady because she's rich and pretty. He said his dad told him you were just trying to get famous. Thomas sighed, brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's face. And that made you angry. She nodded fiercely. You're not like that. You help people because it's right, like Mom always said. Thomas felt his throat tighten at the mention of Margaret's oft-repeated moral code. Your mom was right about that, but she also taught us that violence isn't how we solve problems. I know, Sophie admitted, but he wouldn't stop Dad. He kept saying mean things about you and Mom. About Mom? Thomas frowned. What did he say about Mom? Sophie looked away. He said she wasn't a hero, that the crash was probably her fault. That's when I hit him. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, mastering the surge of anger. When he opened them, he gathered Sophie into a tight hug. Listen to me, he said softly. What happened to Mom wasn't her fault. It wasn't anyone on that plane's fault. And Joey doesn't know what he's talking about. Then why did they say it was an accident? Sophie asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Why didn't anyone get in trouble? The innocent question cut straight to Thomas's heart. How could he explain corporate negligence, regulatory capture, and the power of money to shield the guilty to an 8-year-old? Sometimes, he said carefully, the truth gets buried, but that doesn't make it any less true. Sophie pulled back, studying his face with an intensity that reminded him painfully of Margaret. Is that why you're helping Ms. Mitchell to find the truth? Thomas considered the question, realizing that in Sophie's simple framing lay a profound clarity that had eluded him in his adult complexities. Maybe it is, he acknowledged, but that doesn't mean you get to punch people who say stupid things. A small smile finally broke through Sophie's solemn expression. Even if they really deserve it. Despite himself, Thomas chuckled. Even then. Now come on, let's get home. We both got a big day tomorrow. As they drove home through the gathering dusk, Thomas found himself thinking about Eleanor's words. This isn't just about the past anymore. It's about making sure history doesn't repeat itself. For 8 years, he'd been stuck in a holding pattern, circling the wreckage of his former life without ever moving forward. Perhaps it was finally time to chart a new course, not away from the past, but through it. Tomorrow he would face Robert Vance again, the man whose signature had grounded Thomas's safety concerns, the man who through action or inaction had helped send Margaret's plane into its fatal dive. For the first time in 8 years, Thomas Reed felt the stirring of something he'd thought long dead, the will to fight. The Mitchell Aerospace headquarters gleamed in the morning sun, its glass facade reflecting the Bay Area's clear blue sky. Thomas sat in his truck outside, hands gripping the steering wheel, preparing himself for what was to come. 8 years of carefully constructed distance from his past was about to collapse into a single moment, the moment he would face Robert Vance again. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. We're in the main conference room, 12th floor. Engineering team is assembled. Thomas took a deep breath, straightened his collar, and stepped out of the truck. He'd opted for a button-down shirt and sport coat. Not quite executive attire, but a deliberate step up from his usual work clothes. Walter had insisted. You're not walking in there as a mechanic, the older man had said that morning, brushing lint from Thomas's shoulder. You're walking in as the expert you are. Dress the part. The security guard recognized him from the day before, nodding him through with minimal fuss. As the elevator climbed toward the 12th floor, Thomas mentally reviewed the data he'd compiled, the simulations he'd run late into the night. The evidence was irrefutable, assuming anyone was willing to see it. The conference room doors were glass, offering Thomas a preview of what awaited him. Eleanor stood at the head of a long table flanked by her senior engineering team. Seated across from her was Robert Vance, still with the same silver-streaked dark hair and imperious posture that Thomas remembered, though time had added weight to his frame and deepened the lines around his mouth. Thomas paused, watching through the gauze as Eleanor gestured to a display screen showing the LEAP-X schematics. Even from a distance, the tension in the room was palpable. Vance's expression was one of practiced patience wearing thin. Taking a final steadying breath, Thomas pushed through the door. The conversation halted abruptly. Eleanor looked up, relief flashing briefly across her face. Thomas, thank you for joining us, she said with professional warmth. We were just discussing the preliminary findings from your review. Robert Vance turned, his expression shifting from irritation to momentary confusion, then to cold recognition. Reed, he said, the single syllable carrying 8 years of history. Vance, Thomas replied evenly, taking a seat beside Eleanor. It's been a while. A tense silence followed, broken only when Eleanor cleared her throat. Mr. Reed has identified some critical concerns with the LEAP-X cooling system. She continued, directing everyone's attention back to the display. He's prepared a detailed analysis for us to review. Vance's jaw tightened visibly. I wasn't aware Pinnacle's former employees were now consulting on proprietary Mitchell technology. Former Pinnacle and former Navy, Thomas corrected. And I'm here at Miss Mitchell's request to ensure the engine meets all safety parameters. Eleanor nodded. Thomas is one of the foremost experts on aviation thermal dynamics. His input has been invaluable. Vance smiled thinly. I'm well aware of Mr. Reed's expertise, as well as his tendency toward excessive caution. I believe the term you used 8 years ago was alarmist, Thomas replied, maintaining steady eye contact. Right before you shelved my report on the P520 cooling system, the room temperatures seemed to drop several degrees. The Mitchell engineers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ancient history, Vance said dismissively. A tragedy that was thoroughly investigated and ruled an accident due to extreme weather conditions. Convenient, Thomas remarked. Gentlemen, Eleanor interjected firmly, we're here to discuss the LEAP-X, not past projects. Thomas, would you please walk us through your findings? Thomas nodded, forcing himself to focus on the present. He stood, taking control of the display screen. The LEAP-X cooling system relies on a revolutionary approach to heat dissipation. He began bringing up the relevant schematics. Under normal operating conditions, it's elegant and efficient. However, for the next 20 minutes, Thomas methodically laid out his concerns using simulations and thermal mapping to demonstrate the potential failure points. He kept his tone professional, his explanations clear, and rooted in engineering principles rather than emotion. When he finished, silence hung over the room. Several of the Mitchell engineers were nodding thoughtfully, already making notes about potential modifications. These are worst-case scenarios, Vance said, finally hit his tone dismissive. The chances of these specific conditions aligning are infinitesimal. The same was said about the P520, Thomas countered, until it happened. Vance's eyes narrowed. You've never accepted the official findings on that incident, have you? Reed's still looking for someone to blame for your personal loss. Several engineers shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor's expression hardened. That's enough, Robert, she said sharply. Thomas's analysis stands on its own merits regardless of past events. The data is clear. What's clear, Vance replied, rising to his feet, is that you've allowed a man with a personal vendetta to compromise a project representing hundreds of millions in investment. Westland expected a prototype ready for demonstration in 4 months, not another design phase. Eleanor remained calm. Safety takes precedence over schedule. Always. Noble sentiments, Vance said with a cold smile. I wonder if your board of directors and shareholders will share that perspective when Westland reconsiders its investment position. Is that a threat? Thomas asked quietly. Vance ignored him, focusing on Eleanor. I'll need to take these findings back to our technical team for review. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you reconsider bringing in consultants with obvious conflicts of interest. With that, he gathered his materials and strode from the room, leaving a tense silence in his wake. After a moment, Eleanor addressed her team. David, Sarah, I want you to begin working on redesign options based on Thomas's findings. The rest of you, please continue with your assigned tasks. We'll reconvene this afternoon to discuss next steps. As the engineers filed out, murmuring among themselves, Eleanor turned to Thomas. Well, that went about as expected, she said, attempting lightness, though her expression remained troubled. He'll try to discredit me, Thomas warned, and he'll pressure your board. Eleanor nodded. I know, but I meant what I said. Safety comes first. If that costs us Westland's investment, so be it. Thomas studied her, impressed despite his concerns. That's a courageous stance. Or a foolish one, she replied with a hint of a smile. Time will tell. They walked together toward Eleanor's office, passing through the bustling engineering floor. Thomas could feel curious glances following them. News of the confrontation would already be spreading through the company. Vance won't stop at pulling investment, Thomas said once they reached the privacy of Eleanor's office. He'll do whatever it takes to protect his reputation. Eleanor moved to the window, gazing out at the San Francisco skyline, including bearing the truth about Flight 520. That's ancient history, as he said. The investigation is closed. Eleanor turned back to face him. Or is it just buried? Something in her tone made Thomas pause. What aren't you telling me? She hesitated, then moved to her desk, retrieving a tablet from a drawer. After our dinner, I had my legal team dig deeper into the Pinnacle investigation. They found something interesting. She handed him the tablet. On it was a partially redacted internal Pinnacle memo dated 2 weeks before the crash. Thomas recognized the format immediately. It was a response to one of his safety alerts. As he read, his pulse quickened. Reed's concerns noted. It read, cost analysis indicates retrofit would require grounding fleet for minimum 6 weeks. Financial impact in approx. 94 million brechures. Recommendation to monitor situation, implement modification during next scheduled major maintenance cycle waitest. 14 months. Acceptable risk profile given limited conditions required for failure. At the bottom was a signature, Robert Vance, Director of Safety. Thomas stared at the document, a cold weight settling in his stomach. Where did you get this? It was buried in the appendices of the NTSB investigation, Eleanor replied. Technically public record, but effectively hidden among thousands of pages of technical documentation. This proves they knew, Thomas said quietly, a complex mixture of vindication and renewed grief washing over him. They made a calculated decision to gamble with people's lives. It proves Vance knew, Eleanor corrected gently. And now he's in a position to potentially make the same kind of decision with our engine. Thomas set the tablet down carefully as if it might shatter under the weight of its revelations. What do you intend to do with this? He asked. Depends. Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze steadily. What do you want to do with it? The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Thomas thought of Sophie, of the promise he'd made to protect her from further pain. He thought of Margaret, of her unwavering belief in doing what was right, regardless of consequence. I need time to think, he said finally. Eleanor nodded. Take all the time you need. But Thomas, she hesitated, then continued with careful precision. Vance already sees you as a threat. If we move forward with this, you need to be prepared for what might come. I'm not afraid of Robert Vance, Thomas replied. It's not fear I'm worried about, Eleanor said. It's what happens when the past we've tried to outrun finally catches up to us. Thomas drove home in a daze, the implications of the document swirling in his mind. For 8 years, he'd lived with the official narrative that Flight 520's crash was a tragic accident, the result of extreme weather conditions and mechanical failure that couldn't have been reasonably predicted. Now he had proof of what he'd always suspected: the failure had been predicted. The warning ignored the risk calculated and deemed acceptable in the cold mathematics of corporate finance. When he arrived home, he found Walter sitting on his porch, a newspaper folded on his lap, and a concerned expression on his weathered face. That bad, huh? The older man asked as Thomas approached. Worse, Thomas replied, dropping heavily into the adjacent chair. He briefly recounted the confrontation with Vance and the discovery of the damning memo. Walter listened in silence, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When Thomas finished, the older man shook his head slowly. I saw the same thing after the Apollo 1 fire, he said. Warnings, ignored corners, cut all in the name of schedule and budget. 3 good men paid the price. At least NASA owned up to it, Thomas replied bitterly. They changed their procedures, learned from it. Pinnacle just buried everything and moved on. So what are you going to do now? Thomas stared out at the quiet street, watching a neighbor walk her dog in the afternoon sun. Normal life continuing all around him while his own had been upended yet again. I don't know, he admitted. Part of me wants to take this all the way, reopen the investigation, make Vance answer for what happened. But another part is thinking about Sophie, Walter finished for him. Thomas nodded. She's finally in a good place. School's going well, she has friends, she's stopped having the nightmares. If I drag all this up again, you're afraid it will open old wounds. Wouldn't you be? Walter considered this, his gaze distant. After Margaret died, I spent a lot of time telling you that Sophie needed stability, routine, safety. And she did. But Thomas, he turned to look directly at his friend. She also needs to see her father stand for something. Children don't need perfect parents. They need authentic ones. Thomas absorbed this in silence. Besides, Walter continued more gently, she's asking questions already. That incident at school made that clear. She's trying to make sense of what happened to her mother, just like you are. Before Thomas could respond, his phone rang. The school again. With a sense of dread, he answered. Mr. Reed, this is Principal Hargrove again. I'm afraid there's been another incident with Sophie. Thomas's stomach dropped. Is she hurt? No, nothing like that. But she didn't attend her detention this afternoon. We can't seem to find her on campus. Thomas was already on his feet. What do you mean you can't find her? She was in her last class, but when it came time for detention, she didn't show up. We've searched the grounds. She's not here, Mr. Reed. Call the police, Thomas said, panic rising. I'm on my way. He hung up, already moving toward his truck. Walter followed, concern etched in every line of his face. Sophie's missing, Thomas explained tersely. She didn't show up for detention. I'll drive, Walter said firmly, taking the keys from Thomas's shaking hand. You make calls. As they sped toward the school, Thomas's mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had she run away, been taken? Was this somehow connected to Vance, to the reopened wounds of the past? No, he told himself. This was probably just a frightened child avoiding punishment. Sophie had never skipped school before, had never been in serious trouble, but there was a first time for everything. At the school, they found Principal Hargrove coordinating with 2 police officers. A search of Sophie's locker had revealed nothing unusual, and her backpack was missing, suggesting she had left voluntarily. When was the last time anyone saw her? Thomas demanded. Her last class ended at 2:30, Principal Hargrove replied. Detention was supposed to begin at 300. That's almost 2 hours ago, Thomas said, checking his watch with mounting anxiety. One of the officers approached. Mr. Reed, does your daughter have a cell phone? Thomas shook his head. Not yet. We've been waiting until she's older. Any friends she might have gone to, places she likes to visit? Thomas listed several possibilities. Sophie's best friend's house, the library, the park near their home. Police were dispatched to check each location. As the search expanded, Thomas felt increasingly helpless. This was his fault. If he hadn't gotten involved with Mitchell Aerospace, if he hadn't confronted Vance, if he hadn't stirred up the past. His phone rang an unknown number. He answered immediately. Thomas Reed, he said, his voice tight with tension. Mr. Reed, this is Daniel Rodriguez. The voice was young, uncertain. I think I might have your daughter here. Thomas froze. Who is this? Where's Sophie? She's safe, the young man replied quickly. She's right here at the Aviation Museum. She said you'd know who I am, that my dad was the pilot on Flight 520. Thomas felt the world tilt beneath him. Captain Rodriguez's son. Yes, sir, I volunteer at the Oakland Aviation Museum after school. Sophie showed up about an hour ago asking questions about the Pinnacle crash. When I realized who she was, well, I thought I should call you. Relief flooded through Thomas, quickly followed by confusion. How did she know to find you there? She said she overheard you talking to someone named Walter about me, that I'd been trying to contact you. Thomas looked at Walter, who appeared equally baffled. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Please keep her there. After hanging up, Thomas turned to Walter. Sophie's at the Aviation Museum. Apparently with Captain Rodriguez's son, the one you mentioned, might try to contact me someday. Walter's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. I mentioned it once, maybe 2 months ago. That girl doesn't miss a thing, does she? They quickly informed the police and Principal Hargrove of Sophie's whereabouts, then drove to the museum, a converted hangar at the old Oakland airport that housed a collection of historic aircraft and aviation memorabilia. Inside, they found Sophie sitting on a bench near a glass case containing Pinnacle Airlines artifacts, deep in conversation with a lanky teenager in a museum volunteer shirt. The boy stood as Thomas approached, his posture straightening nervously. Mr. Reed, he said, extending his hand. Daniel Rodriguez. Thomas shook it automatically, his attention primarily on Sophie, who was looking up at him with a mixture of defiance and apprehension. What were you thinking? Thomas demanded, relief making his voice sharper than intended. Do you have any idea how worried I was? Sophie's chin jutted out. I wanted to know the truth about Mom, about the crash. You never talk about it. Thomas felt as though he'd been struck. Sophie, Daniel's dad was the pilot, she continued, gesturing to the uncomfortable-looking teenager. He has his dad's flight logs and everything. He knows what really happened. Thomas glanced at Daniel, who shifted his weight anxiously. I didn't encourage her, sir, the boy said quickly. She just showed up asking questions. When she said who she was, well, I've been wanting to talk to you anyway. Walter stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on Thomas's shoulder. Why don't we all sit down? I think there's a lot that needs to be said. They moved to a quiet corner of the museum, away from the few afternoon visitors. Daniel hesitantly explained how he'd recognized Thomas's name from his father's personal effects notebooks, where Captain Rodriguez had documented his concerns about the Pinnacle aircraft. Dad kept detailed logs of everything, Daniel explained, pulling a worn notebook from his backpack. He noted temperature fluctuations in the cooling system of the P520 on 3 separate flights before the crash. He reported them each time. Daniel passed the notebook to Thomas, who opened it with reverent care. Inside, in precise handwriting, were the captain's observations, professional detailed, with none of the alarmism Vance had accused Thomas of. April 3rd, 2017, Thomas read aloud. Unusual temperature spike in cooling system during climb, stabilized after reducing to 80% thrust. Maintenance advised, reference report, number P520-4397. He looked up at Daniel. Did the investigation team see these? And Daniel nodded. They took his official logbooks, but this was his personal record. When they ruled it was an unexpected mechanical failure, I knew something wasn't right. Dad wouldn't have missed warning signs. He didn't, Thomas said quietly. Neither of us did. We just weren't listened to. Sophie had been watching the exchange intently. So Mom's plane crashed because someone didn't fix something they knew was broken. The directness of the question, delivered with a child's piercing clarity, left Thomas momentarily speechless. Yes, he finally admitted the truth he'd tried to shield her from finally exposed. That's exactly what happened. Sophie absorbed this, her young face solemn. And now the same man is trying to do it again with Mitchell's company. Thomas exchanged a glance with Walter, surprised at Sophie's understanding of the situation. How did you know about that? He asked. I heard you and Walter talking last night. And I saw the video of you and that man arguing at Ms. Mitchell's company. It's all over YouTube. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Of course it was. In the digital age, nothing stayed private. Sophie, he said carefully, I understand you want answers. I do too. But running away from school, coming here alone, that wasn't safe or responsible. I left a note in my math book, she protested. It's not my fault no one found it. Despite everything, Thomas felt a smile tugging at his lips, so much like her mother, resourceful, determined, and just a bit too clever for her own good. Daniel cleared his throat. Mr. Reed, there's something else you should know. I've been collecting information about the crash for years. News reports, technical bulletins, interviews with former Pinnacle employees. I think there's enough to reopen the investigation. Thomas studied the young man before him, perhaps 17, with his father's steady gaze and earnest demeanor. Why are you doing this, Daniel? He asked gently. The teenager's expression hardened slightly. Because they said my father made a mistake, that he missed warning signs, that the crash was partly pilot error. My dad flew for 20 years without a single incident. He wouldn't have missed something like this. Thomas nodded, understanding completely. No, he wouldn't have. Walter, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Sounds to me like you two have been fighting the same battle from different sides. Maybe it's time we fought it together. Thomas suggested, a new resolve forming within him. He turned to Sophie. But that includes you two, kiddo. No more secrets, no more running off. If you have questions, you ask me directly. Deal? Sophie nodded solemnly. Deal. Does this mean we're going to help Ms. Mitchell too? Thomas glanced at Daniel, then at Walter, feeling the weight of the moment at the convergence of past and present, of personal grief and professional responsibility. Yes, he said finally. I think it does. Later that evening, after Sophie had gone to bed grounded, but with a newfound understanding of her mother's story, Thomas sat in his small home office poring over Daniel's collection of materials on the Pinnacle crash. The teenager had generously allowed him to borrow everything: news clippings, technical bulletins, even a spreadsheet tracking the careers of key Pinnacle executives after the disaster. Most had moved on to other companies, their connections to the tragedy gradually obscured by time and career transitions. Robert Vance's rise at Westland had been particularly meteoric, fueled by his reputation for pragmatic risk management, a euphemism that now turned Thomas's stomach. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. Walter stood there holding 2 glasses of bourbon. Thought you might need this, the older man said, setting one glass on the desk. Find anything useful? Thomas gestured to the sprawl of documents. Daniel's been thorough. He's tracked everyone involved: engineers, executives, investigators. Even identified 3 other incidents with P-500 series aircraft that were classified as minor, but showed similar thermal patterns. Walter pulled up a chair. Smart kid. Like his father, Thomas agreed, taking a sip of the bourbon. Margaret always said Rodriguez was the most meticulous pilot she'd ever flown with. Seems his son inherited that trait. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling around them. So what's your next move? Walter finally asked. Thomas sighed. I need to talk to Eleanor. If we're going to challenge Vance, she needs to know what she's getting into. This could get ugly for Mitchell Aerospace. And for you, Braden, Walter pointed out. Vance has resources connections. He won't go down without a fight. I know, but after seeing Sophie today talking to Daniel, Thomas shook his head. I can't walk away again, Walt. Not this time. Walter nodded, understanding in his weathered features. For what it's worth, I think Margaret would approve. She'd do more than approve, Thomas replied with a faint smile. She'd be leading the charge. The next morning, Thomas arranged to meet Eleanor at a small cafe near the Mitchell Aerospace building. He arrived early. Daniel's materials, organized in a leather portfolio Walter had insisted he use. Appearances matter when you are waging war, the older man had said. Eleanor arrived precisely on time, dressed more casually than usual in jeans and a simple blazer. Without the trappings of corporate power, she looked younger, though no less formidable. "You sounded serious on the phone," she said after ordering coffee. "Has something happened?" Thomas nodded, opening the portfolio. "I met someone yesterday who's been compiling evidence about the Pinnacle crash. Captain Rodriguez's son." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "The pilot, how did that happen?" Thomas gave her the abbreviated version of Sophie's unauthorized museum visit, watching as Eleanor's expression shifted from surprise to something like admiration. "She's quite something, your daughter," she observed. "Too much like her mother sometimes." Thomas agreed ruefully before turning serious again. "Daniel has been gathering information for years, combined with the memo you found in my own documentation from that time. Eleanor, I think there's enough to justify reopening the NTSB investigation." Eleanor absorbed this, her keen mind visibly processing implications. That would be explosive. For Pinnacle, for Westland, for Vance personally. And potentially for Mitchell Aerospace, Thomas acknowledged. Your connection to Westland would be scrutinized. There could be financial repercussions. "I'm aware," she replied, her voice steady. "But if there's evidence of negligence that caused 58 deaths, that supersedes any corporate concerns." Thomas studied her, impressed by her moral clarity. "This won't be easy. Vance has spent 8 years burying this story, building his reputation on the foundation of that cover-up. He'll fight back with everything he has." "Let him," Eleanor said simply. "Some things are worth fighting for." The conviction in her voice resonated with something long dormant in Thomas's chest, a belief in principles over pragmatism and truth over convenience. It reminded him with an almost physical ache of Margaret. "There's something else," he said, pulling out Captain Rodriguez's notebook. "These are the captain's personal logs. He documented the same issues I was seeing in the lab. If we combine this with my technical reports and the memo you found, we have a pattern of willful negligence," Eleanor finished, "enough to warrant a formal review." Thomas nodded. "But we need to move carefully. Vance has influence at the FAA, possibly even at the NTSB. We need to make sure this evidence gets to the right people, people who can't be pressured to bury it again." Eleanor considered this, then pulled out her phone. "I think I know someone who can help. James Forrester, senior investigator with the NTSB. He's an old friend, incorruptible and thorough." As she made the call, Thomas felt a strange sense of déjà vu. 8 years ago, he'd sat in another cafe showing Margaret his concerns about the P520 cooling system, planning how to elevate the issue without being silenced by corporate hierarchy. The memory no longer carried only pain. Now it held purpose as well. Eleanor finished her call, looking satisfied. "James can meet us tomorrow morning at his office in Oakland. He'll review what we have privately before deciding whether to formally reopen the investigation." "Thank you," Thomas said sincerely. "I know this could cause problems for Mitchell." Eleanor waved away his concern. "If Mitchell Aerospace can't survive doing the right thing, then it doesn't deserve to survive at all." The simplicity of her moral calculus struck Thomas. In a world of corporate hedging and risk management spreadsheets, such clarity was rare and valuable. As they parted ways outside the cafe, Eleanor paused. "Thomas, there's something else you should know. After our meeting yesterday, Robert called an emergency session with our board of directors. He's pushing to have me removed as CEO, claiming my judgment has been compromised by personal factors." Thomas felt a surge of guilt. "This is my fault." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "This is the result of me doing exactly what I should be doing, prioritizing safety over schedule, integrity over expediency. If the board doesn't support those values, then perhaps I shouldn't be leading Mitchell Aerospace anyway." "What can I do?" Thomas asked. Eleanor's smile held a hint of steel. "Be ready for tomorrow. Bring everything you have. And Thomas," she hesitated briefly, "thank Sophie for me. Sometimes it takes a child's determination to remind us adults what really matters." As Thomas watched her walk away, he felt something shift within him, as if pieces, long misaligned, were finally settling into their proper places. For 8 years, he'd been surviving, existing in the shadow of tragedy. Now he was beginning to live again, to fight for something beyond mere persistence. It was terrifying, and it was right. The following morning brought rain, a steady soaking downpour that seemed to mirror the gravity of the day ahead. Thomas had spent hours organizing the evidence, creating a chronology that clearly demonstrated the pattern of ignored warnings and subsequent cover-up. Sophie, still grounded but deeply invested in the unfolding events, had helped him label folders and organize the timeline. Her simple questions had often cut to the heart of complex issues, forcing Thomas to distill technical details into their essential truths. So this man knew the planes might crash, but he let people fly in them anyway, she had asked, her young face solemn. He thought the risk was small enough to be acceptable, Thomas had explained carefully. Sophie had considered this, but it wasn't his risk to take, was it the people on the plane didn't know? Out of the mouths of babes, Thomas thought now as he drove through the rain toward the NTSB regional office. The fundamental violation at the heart of the matter, decisions about life and death, made without informed consent, risk calculated in boardrooms and imposed on unsuspecting families. He arrived to find Eleanor already waiting under the building's awning, an umbrella in hand. Beside her stood a man Thomas didn't recognize, tall African-American with the erect posture of someone accustomed to authority. Thomas, Eleanor greeted him. This is James Forrester, senior investigator with the NTSB. Forrester extended his hand, his grip firm and assessing. Mr. Reed, I've heard a great deal about you this morning. All good, I hope, Thomas replied, matching the man's steady gaze. Concerning more than good, Forrester said. If what Ms. Mitchell has outlined is accurate, we have a serious situation on our hands. They proceeded inside, where Forrester led them to a private conference room. The walls were lined with photographs of crash investigations, silent testimonies to the cost of failure in aviation. For the next 2 hours, Thomas methodically presented their evidence, his original safety reports, Eleanor's discovery of the suppressed memo, Daniel's collection of incident reports showing a pattern of similar issues, and finally Captain Rodriguez's personal logs documenting the very problems Thomas had warned about. Forrester listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but offering no indication of his thoughts. When Thomas finally finished, the investigator sat in silence for several long moments. In 23 years with the NTSB, he finally said, I've seen my share of corporate corner cutting, but this, he tapped the memo authorizing the delay of crucial safety modifications. This is as clear a case of negligence as I've encountered. Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. To be believed after 8 years of doubt and dismissal was more powerful than he'd anticipated. The question now, Forrester continued, is how to proceed. Reopening a closed investigation, especially one with such high-profile implications, requires substantial justification. I believe we have that justification, but we'll face significant resistance. From Westland, Eleanor supplied, and from within the regulatory bodies themselves, Forrester acknowledged. No one likes admitting that they may have missed something of this magnitude. So what happens next? Thomas asked. I'll present this evidence to the board for review, Forrester said. Given the nature of the materials, I believe they'll authorize a preliminary reassessment. That's not a full reopening, but it gets the door ajar. How long will that take? Eleanor asked. Under normal circumstances, weeks. Given the sensitivity here, I'll push for days. Forrester turned to Thomas. In the meantime, Mr. Reed, I suggest you prepare for scrutiny. When Westland learns of this, they'll come after your credibility. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. I've been anticipating that. One more thing, Forrester added, his expression grave. This information doesn't leave this room until the board authorizes the reassessment. Any premature disclosure could compromise the entire process. Both Thomas and Eleanor agreed to the condition, though Thomas made a mental note to inform Daniel of the developments. The young man had earned that much. As they left the building, the rain had intensified, drumming against Eleanor's umbrella as they huddled beneath it. It's really happening, Thomas said, a complex mixture of emotions in his voice. After all this time, Eleanor nodded, her shoulder brushing against his. How does it feel? Surreal, he admitted. For 8 years I've carried this certainty that I was right, that I could have prevented it if only someone had listened. Now that someone finally is listening, it doesn't bring them back, Eleanor finished gently. No, but it matters anyway. Margaret always believed that truth had intrinsic value beyond any practical outcome. Thomas smiled faintly at the memory. She used to quote Kant to me, something about the moral imperative to act as if your actions would become universal law. She sounds remarkable, Eleanor said. She was. Thomas looked at Eleanor directly. She would have liked you, I think. Your clarity, your willingness to stand on principle. A moment of understanding passed between them, profound in its simplicity. Then Eleanor's phone rang, breaking the spell. Her expression darkened as she checked the screen. "It's my assistant," she said, "the board meeting." She answered, listening intently before ending the call with a terse acknowledgement. "The board has called an emergency session for this afternoon," she told Thomas. Vance moved faster than expected. "They're voting on a motion to suspend me pending a review of my leadership." "That's absurd," Thomas protested. "You're acting in the company's best interests." "Not according to Westland's definition of best interests," Eleanor replied grimly. "I need to get back to prepare." "Let me come with you," Thomas said impulsively. "I can explain the technical concerns, make them understand what's at stake." Eleanor hesitated. "Thomas, I appreciate the offer, but this is corporate politics at its worst. You'd be walking into a hostile environment." "I've faced worse," he replied simply. After a moment's consideration, Eleanor nodded. "All right, but remember we can't disclose anything about the NTSB meeting, not yet." As they drove toward Mitchell Aerospace headquarters, Thomas felt an unfamiliar sensation building within him. Not anxiety or dread, but a kind of clarity he hadn't experienced since his days in the cockpit. The focused awareness that came with flying through a storm, knowing that every decision mattered, that precision and courage were the only path through. For the first time in 8 years, Thomas Reed wasn't running from the past. He was using it as fuel, as guidance, as a map towards something that mattered more than his own comfort or safety. Margaret would have understood. Sophie, in her innocent wisdom, already did. Now it was time for the Mitchell Aerospace Board of Directors to understand as well. The Mitchell Aerospace boardroom occupied the entire top floor of the headquarters building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of San Francisco Bay. On a clear day, the vista would have been spectacular. Today, rain lashed against the glass, turning the outside world into a gray, distorted watercolor. Inside, the atmosphere was equally turbulent. 10 board members sat around a massive mahogany table, their expressions ranging from concern to outright hostility. At the head of the table, Eleanor stood composed but alert, like a captain facing a mutiny. Robert Vance occupied a seat near the chairman, Howard Kimball, a silver-haired veteran of the aerospace industry, whose neutral expression gave nothing away. Thomas sat slightly apart, an observer rather than a participant, though the occasional glances cast his way made it clear his presence was unwelcome to many. "This emergency session has been called to address concerns about recent management decisions." Kimball began, his voice measured. "Specifically, the decision to initiate a significant redesign of the LEAP-X engine at this late stage, potentially jeopardizing our contract with Westland and our delivery timeline." Eleanor nodded acknowledgement. "I'm prepared to explain the technical necessity of these modifications." "Before we get to that," interrupted Douglas Mercer, a board member with close ties to Westland, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room." He gestured toward Thomas. "Why is Mr. Reed here? This is a closed board meeting." "Mr. Reed is here at my invitation," Eleanor replied coolly. "As the engineer who identified the critical safety concerns with the current design, he's best positioned to explain their technical significance." "An engineer who happens to have a well-documented history with Mr. Vance," Mercer countered, "and whose objectivity might reasonably be questioned." Thomas felt Vance's eyes on him, calculating and cold. "If we're questioning objectivity," Eleanor said, "perhaps we should also discuss Mr. Vance's dual role as both a Westland executive and an advisor to this board on matters directly affecting Westland's interests." A tense silence followed, broken by Chairman Kimball clearing his throat. "Let's stay focused," he said firmly. "The issue before us is whether the decision to redesign the LEAP-X cooling system was technically justified and in the company's best interests. Ms. Mitchell, please proceed with your explanation." Eleanor nodded to Thomas, who rose and moved to the digital display at the end of the room. For the next 20 minutes, he walked the board through his findings, careful to present only the technical facts without any reference to Flight 520 or the NTS meeting that morning. He focused on the specific vulnerability in the current design, using simulations to demonstrate how, under certain conditions, the system would fail catastrophically. The flaw isn't obvious, he concluded. Under normal operating parameters, you'd never see it. But commercial aircraft don't always operate under normal parameters. When they encounter the outlier conditions, which statistically will happen eventually, the result would be catastrophic failure. What's the statistical probability of these outlier conditions? Vance asked, his tone suggesting the answer was negligible. Approximately 1 in 50,000 flight hours, Thomas replied, which means that in a fleet of 100 aircraft, each flying 5,000 hours of onboard, you could expect an incident every decade. One potential incident per decade, Vance emphasized, versus guaranteed financial losses now. One catastrophic failure, Thomas corrected firmly, with potential loss of all souls aboard. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The redesign would delay deployment by how long? Chairman Kimball asked. 4 to 6 months, Eleanor replied, which would put us beyond Westland's demonstration deadline. Unacceptable, Vance said flatly. The Defense Department contract has specific timelines. Missing them opens the door to competitors. And rushing a flawed design opens the door to disaster, Thomas countered. Eleanor stepped forward. Board members, I understand the financial implications of delay, but Mitchell Aerospace was founded on a commitment to safety and engineering excellence. If we compromise those values for a deadline, we're no longer the company my father built. Vance's smile was thin. Noble sentiments, Eleanor, but sentiment doesn't pay shareholders or keep employees on payroll. Neither does bankruptcy from liability claims when an aircraft fails, she replied evenly. Chairman Kimball raised a hand to forestall further debate. I think we understand the parameters of the decision. Now the board needs to determine whether management's judgment in this matter has been sound. He turned to Eleanor. Ms. Mitchell, Mr. Vance has suggested that your decision-making has been influenced by personal factors. Would you care to address that? Eleanor's posture straightened imperceptibly. If by personal factors Mr. Vance means a commitment to passenger safety over profit margins, then yes, I'm influenced by that principle. It's the foundation of this company. I think he means your apparent personal relationship with Mr. Reed, Mercer interjected. Thomas felt a flash of anger, but Eleanor remained unruffled. My working relationship with Mr. Reed is professional, she stated. His expertise was sought because of his recognized authority and thermodynamics expertise this board previously celebrated when we recruited him as a consultant. Until his recommendations threatened the Westland timeline, Thomas added, unable to remain silent. Vance's expression hardened. Let's be clear about what's happening here. Mr. Reed has a personal vendetta related to past events at Pinnacle Aviation. He's using Mitchell Aerospace as a vehicle for that vendetta, and Ms. Mitchell is allowing it regardless of the consequences for this company. That's not true, Thomas began, but Eleanor raised a hand silencing him. Robert, she said, addressing Vance directly, we've known each other for years. I've always respected your business acumen, but this isn't about Thomas Reed's past or my judgment. It's about a legitimate safety concern that no responsible aerospace company can ignore. She turned to address the full board. If you vote to suspend me for prioritizing safety over schedule, you're setting a precedent that will define this company's future. I urge you to consider what's truly at stake. Chairman Kimball nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. I believe the board has heard enough to deliberate. We'll ask you and Mr. Reed to step outside while we discuss and vote. In the anteroom outside the boardroom, Thomas paced while Eleanor stood by the window watching the rain. Neither spoke for several minutes, the weight of the moment settling between them. I'm sorry, Thomas finally said. This is exactly what you were worried about, Vance making it personal. Eleanor turned from the window. Don't apologize for doing the right thing, Thomas. Ever. Still your career. My career isn't worth much if it comes at the cost of my integrity, she interrupted, or people's lives. Thomas studied her, this woman who had unexpectedly become his ally, in a battle he'd thought long lost. In her determination, her principled stand, he saw echoes of Margaret, the same clear-eyed courage, the same unwavering moral compass. Whatever happens in there, he said quietly, I want you to know I'm grateful. Not many would have taken this stand. Eleanor's smile was tinged with sadness. My father used to say that character is what you do when no one else would know the difference. But someone always knows Thomas, even if it's just yourself. Before Thomas could respond, the boardroom door opened. Chairman Kimball's assistant gestured them back inside. The board members sat in strained silence, their expressions unreadable. Chairman Kimball waited until Eleanor and Thomas had resumed their seats before speaking. The board has reached a decision, he announced. By a vote of 6-4, we have rejected the motion to suspend Ms. Mitchell. However, he raised a hand to forestall any reaction. We are implementing oversight measures for the LeapX project. A special committee of 3 board members will review all major decisions moving forward. Relief washed through Thomas, tempered by the realization that the battle was far from over. Eleanor's expression remained professionally neutral, though he caught the subtle relaxation of her shoulders. "Thank you, Chairman," she said simply. "I appreciate the board's confidence." Vance stood abruptly. "This is a mistake. Westland cannot continue to support a project with this level of uncertainty and mismanagement. I'll be recommending an immediate reevaluation of our partnership." "That's your prerogative, Robert," Chairman Kimball replied calmly. "But perhaps before you do, you might want to hear Mr. Reed's complete assessment, not just of the current design, but of the alternatives we're developing." Thomas glanced at Eleanor, who nodded slightly, giving him permission to proceed. "The redesign isn't just about fixing a flaw," Thomas explained, turning to the display and bringing up new schematics. "It's an opportunity to implement next-generation cooling technology that would actually improve performance beyond the original specifications." For the next 10 minutes, he outlined the alternative approach he'd been developing with the Mitchell engineering team, a design that would not only eliminate the safety concern, but potentially increase efficiency by an additional 15% while reducing weight. As he spoke, Thomas noticed the subtle shift in the room from skepticism to grudging interest, even from some of Vance's allies. Only Vance himself remained unmoved, his expression growing increasingly closed. When Thomas finished, Chairman Kimball turned to Vance. "It seems Mitchell may be offering Westland more than was originally promised, albeit on a revised timeline. I'd suggest you consider the full picture before making any recommendations to your board." Vance stood gathering his materials. "I'll take it under advisement, but make no mistake, this delay will have consequences." His gaze settled on Thomas. "For everyone involved." After Vance and several board members had departed, Chairman Kimball approached Eleanor and Thomas. "That was closer than I'd like," he admitted quietly. "Vance had 3 votes locked before we started. If Harriet Chen hadn't been convinced by the technical presentation." He shook his head. "You're not out of the woods yet, Eleanor. Westland can still make things very difficult for us." "I know," Eleanor acknowledged, "but we'll manage." "We always do," Kimball agreed with a thin smile. "Just be careful, both of you. Robert Vance didn't get where he is by accepting defeat gracefully." As they left the building, the rain had finally stopped leaving, the late afternoon air washed clean. Thomas felt a similar clarity within, as if a long clouded horizon had finally begun to clear. "What now?" he asked as they stood in the parking garage. "Now," Eleanor replied, "we prepare for Vance's counterattack because there will be one." Thomas nodded, sobered by the certainty in her voice. "Sophie's school play is tonight. Would you like to come? Walter will be there too." The invitation surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise Eleanor. For a moment, he thought she might decline. "I'd like that," she said instead, a genuine smile warming her features. "Very much. Same." The elementary school auditorium buzzed with the controlled chaos of parents, siblings, and grandparents finding seats before the performance. Sophie's class was performing an abbreviated version of Amelia Earhart Flying Free, and she had been cast as one of Earhart's flight students, a role that delighted her despite its small size. Thomas, Walter, and Eleanor found seats near the middle just as the lights began to dim. Walter had insisted on bringing flowers for Sophie, a tradition he'd maintained since her first school performance 3 years earlier. "She looks just like Margaret did at that age," Walter whispered as Sophie appeared on stage, her face serious with concentration. "Same determined little chin." Thomas nodded, his throat suddenly tight. These moments always brought bittersweet recognition of Margaret's absence, the milestones she would never witness, the growth she would never see. Eleanor, sensing his emotion, gently touched his arm, a brief gesture of understanding that anchored him to the present. The play unfolded with the earnest enthusiasm unique to elementary school productions, forgotten lines, Occasional whispers from the wings, moments of unexpected poignancy amid the childish delivery. Sophie's few lines were delivered with clear precision, her voice carrying to the back of the auditorium. When it ended, the audience applauded with the excessive enthusiasm of people celebrating children they loved. Thomas caught Sophie's eye as she took her bow, her face lighting up at the sight of not just him and Walter, but Eleanor as well. Afterward, amid the crush of proud parents and sugar-fueled children, Sophie launched herself into Thomas's arms. "Did you like it?" she demanded. "Did you see when I used the real compass movements you taught me? You were perfect," Thomas assured her, setting her down as Walter presented the bouquet with ceremonial flourish. "For the finest aviator on the West Coast," the older man announced. Sophie giggled, then turned her attention to Eleanor. "You came?" "I wouldn't have missed it," Eleanor replied warmly. "You were wonderful." Sophie beamed. "Dad says Amelia Earhart was a real pioneer, just like my mom, and just like you." Thomas felt a flush of embarrassment at having his private conversations repeated, but Eleanor seemed touched. "That's a tremendous compliment," she said seriously. "Thank you." "We should celebrate," Walter declared. "I propose ice cream at Fenton's." Sophie's eyes widened with delight. "Can we please, Dad?" "It's a school night," Thomas hedged, though his resistance was largely performative. "I believe exceptional performances warrant exceptional measures," Eleanor offered diplomatically. Thomas surrendered with a smile. "All right, ice cream it is." As they walked toward the exit, Thomas's phone rang. The display showed James Forrester's number. "I need to take this," he said, stepping away from the group. "I'll meet you at the car." The NTSB investigator's voice was tense. "Reed, we have a situation. Someone leaked information about our meeting this morning. It's already on 3 aviation news sites." Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "That's not possible. Eleanor and I haven't said a word." "Well, someone did," Forrester replied grimly. "The stories mention me by name, quote, sources close to the investigation, saying we're reopening the Pinnacle crash based on new evidence." "What does this mean for the review?" "It complicates things. The board doesn't appreciate having its hand forced by media pressure." Forrester paused. "There's more. One of the articles specifically mentions Robert Vance and claims he suppressed safety warnings before the crash." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "He'll assume I leaked it. With good reason. You and Mitchell are the only non-NTSB people who knew about the meeting." "It wasn't us," Thomas insisted. "We understand what's at stake." "Maybe, but someone's playing a dangerous game here." Forrester's voice hardened. "The board is still proceeding with the review, but now it's under a spotlight. That changes the dynamics considerably." After ending the call, Thomas rejoined the others, his expression troubled. "What is it?" Eleanor asked immediately. "Someone leaked information about the NTSB review," he explained quietly, ensuring Sophie couldn't overhear. "It's already public." Eleanor's eyes widened. "That's impossible. We didn't—" "I know." Thomas glanced at Walter, who shook his head firmly, denying any involvement. "But someone did, and Vance will assume it was us." "Perhaps we should postpone ice cream," Walter suggested. "No," Thomas decided, watching Sophie chatting animatedly with her teacher across the lobby. "We're not letting Vance disrupt our lives any more than he already has. We'll deal with this after Sophie's in bed." Eleanor studied him, then nodded. "You're right. Some moments need to be protected." Later, after Sophie had been tucked in with a bedtime story and a second round of congratulations on her performance, Thomas, Walter, and Eleanor gathered in the living room to assess the situation. "The timing is suspicious," Walter observed, "just hours after the board meeting." Eleanor nodded. "Vance wasn't happy with the outcome. This could be his way of retaliating, leaking the information himself, then blaming us for it." "But how would he know about the NTSB meeting?" Thomas asked. "Only you, me, and Forrester knew." A troubled silence fell as they considered the implications. "Someone at the NTSB," Walter suggested. "Or someone followed you this morning?" "Or Mitchell's communications are compromised," Eleanor added grimly. "Corporate espionage isn't uncommon in our industry." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. "Whatever the source, the effect is the same. The investigation is now public, which means Vance will mobilize every resource to discredit it and us." So we respond in kind, Walter said firmly. You have the evidence. It speaks for itself. It's not that simple, Thomas replied. Vance has connections throughout the industry, friends in the regulatory bodies, a PR team at his disposal. He'll frame this as a personal vendetta, just like he did at the board meeting. Then we need to make it impossible to dismiss, Eleanor said, determination hardening her voice. We need more witnesses, more documentation evidence, so compelling that even Vance's connections can't bury it. Daniel Rodriguez, Thomas realized suddenly. He mentioned other former Pinnacle employees who had concerns, people who might have documentation or firsthand knowledge. Start there, Eleanor agreed. I'll have our legal team prepare to support anyone willing to come forward. Walter, who had been checking news sites on his tablet, looked up with a troubled expression. You'll want to see this. It's already escalating. He turned the screen to show them a breaking news story. The headline read, Mitchell Aerospace CEO questions safety of own company's designs in wake of renewed Pinnacle crash investigation. Eleanor scanned the article, her expression darkening. This is a complete distortion. They're suggesting I've admitted our engines are unsafe, that I'm repeating patterns that led to the Pinnacle disaster. Vance, Thomas said grimly. He's moving faster than we anticipated. Mitchell's stock will take a hit when markets open tomorrow. Eleanor observed her tone clinical, despite the personal implications. The board will be furious. You could issue a clarification, Walter suggested. Eleanor shook her head. Responding directly only legitimizes the accusation. We need a different approach. She turned to Thomas. How quickly can you contact Daniel and these other potential witnesses? I'll call him tonight, Thomas promised. But Eleanor, you need to be prepared. The board might not stand with you a second time, and especially if Westland pulls out completely. Let me worry about the board, she replied with quiet confidence. You focus on building the case against Vance. That's our best defense and the right thing to do regardless of the consequences to Mitchell. As Eleanor prepared to leave, Thomas walked her to the door, troubled by the risks she was taking for a cause that wasn't originally hers. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. You could distance yourself, say I acted without authorization. Protect your company. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression softening in the dim light of the entryway. Thomas, do you know why I became an engineer before I became a CEO? He shook his head. Because I believe in building things that matter, things that last, things that help rather than harm. She held his gaze steadily. What we're doing now, holding powerful people accountable, ensuring safety isn't sacrificed for profit, that matters more than any corporate title or stock price. In that moment, with her conviction illuminating her features, Thomas felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared values that transcended professional alliance. Thank you, he said simply. Eleanor smiled, a brief warm gesture that reached her eyes. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be challenging. After she left, Thomas returned to find Walter gathering his things to depart as well. She's quite something, the older man observed, a knowing gleam in his eye. Yes, she is, Thomas agreed, not rising to the bait. Walter chuckled. Margaret would approve, you know. She never wanted you to be alone forever. Thomas felt the familiar pang at his wife's name, but it was gentler now, less raw. It's not like that, Walt. Maybe not yet, Walter replied, patting Thomas's shoulder as he moved to the door. But some of the best flights start with unexpected course corrections. After Walter left, Thomas sat alone in the quiet house, listening to the occasional creak of settling wood and Sophie's soft breathing from down the hall. On the mantel, Margaret's photograph seemed to watch him, her smile frozen in time, her eyes holding the light that had first drawn him to her. What would you think of all this, Meg? He whispered. Am I doing the right thing, or just reopening wounds that were finally healing? No answer came, of course. Yet in the silence, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years, as if the very act of moving forward, of fighting for truth rather than hiding from it, was its own kind of answer. The next morning arrived with the explosive impact Thomas had anticipated. Mitchell Aerospace's stock had dropped 18% in pre-market trading. 3 financial news networks were running stories questioning the company's stability and the safety of its designs. Social media buzzed with speculation and resurfaced footage of the Pinnacle crash. Thomas had spent half the night on the phone with Daniel Rodriguez, compiling a list of former Pinnacle employees who might have relevant information. By morning, they had identified 7 promising contacts, engineers, maintenance technicians, and a former safety inspector, all of whom had left Pinnacle within a year of the crash. After dropping Sophie at school with strict instructions to ignore any talk about her father or Mitchell Aerospace, Thomas drove to Oakland Aviation Museum, where Daniel had offered them use of a small office for the day. The museum was closed to the public on Mondays, providing a measure of privacy for their work. Daniel was waiting when Thomas arrived along with a young man Thomas didn't recognize. "This is my roommate Alex Chen," Daniel explained. "He's a computer science major at Berkeley. I thought he might be able to help with some of the digital aspects." Thomas shook the young man's hand, noting his intense focus and the laptop already open on the desk. "I've been mapping the digital footprint of the Pinnacle investigation," Alex explained without preamble, "looking for patterns in how information was controlled and disseminated." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Is that legal?" "I'm not hacking anything," Alex assured him. "Just analyzing publicly available data, press releases, timing of announcements, who said what when. It's like digital archaeology." Thomas nodded, impressed despite his reservations. "Found anything interesting?" "Several things," Alex replied, turning his laptop to show a complex timeline. "There's a clear pattern of coordinated messaging between Pinnacle, the FAA, and certain media outlets immediately after the crash. The narrative was being actively shaped from day one." Thomas wasn't surprised, but seeing the evidence laid out so methodically was sobering. "What about Vance specifically?" Alex typed, briefly bringing up a new screen. "That's where it gets really interesting. In the 6 months after the crash, Vance gave 17 interviews and spoke at 4 industry conferences. In each appearance, he emphasized the unforeseeable nature of the failure and praised the investigation's thoroughness. Building his reputation on the cover-up," Thomas observed grimly. "Exactly. And then 3 months after the investigation officially closed, he left Pinnacle for Westland with a compensation package 300% larger than his previous salary." Before Thomas could respond, his phone rang. "Eleanor, I'm on my way to you," she said without preamble. "The board has called another emergency meeting for this afternoon. I need everything we have before then." "We're making progress," Thomas assured her. "Daniel and his friend have been compiling evidence all night." "Good, because Vance isn't just attacking Mitchell anymore, he's coming after you directly." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean?" "There's a news story circulating that you were dismissed from Pinnacle not for whistleblowing, but for professional negligence. They're claiming you missed critical warning signs, then tried to shift blame after the crash." Cold anger washed through Thomas. "That's a complete fabrication." "I know, but it's out there now gaining traction. We need to counter it with facts." By the time Eleanor arrived at the museum, Daniel had reached 2 of the former Pinnacle employees on their list. One had agreed to provide a written statement confirming that safety concerns about the P520 had been widely known within the engineering department. The other, more significantly, had preserved copies of internal emails discussing the cooling system, emails that included Robert Vance in the distribution list. Eleanor reviewed these materials with growing satisfaction. This directly contradicts Vance's claim that the failure was unforeseeable. He was explicitly informed of the risk. "Multiple times," Thomas confirmed, pointing to the email dates, "months before the crash." Alex, who had been quietly working in the corner, suddenly straightened. "You should see this." They gathered around his laptop, where he had pulled up a recently published article from an aviation industry blog. The headline read, "Former Pinnacle engineer comes forward, Reed warned us all." The piece featured an interview with Michael Zhang, a senior engineer who had worked directly under Thomas at Pinnacle. Zhang described in detail the concerns Thomas had raised, the tests he had conducted, and the written warnings he had submitted. "Thomas Reed was the only one with the courage to put his career on the line," Zhang was quoted saying. "The rest of us suspected he was right, but we stayed quiet. 58 people died because of that silence. I can't stay quiet anymore." Thomas stared at the screen in disbelief. "Mike Zhang, I haven't heard from him since the crash." "He reached out to me last night," Daniel admitted, "after seeing the news about the reopened investigation. I hope it was okay to put him in touch with that reporter." "More than okay," Eleanor assured him. "This is exactly what we need, credible voices corroborating Thomas's account." As the day progressed, their momentum built. 2 more former Pinnacle employees contacted Daniel offering statements. Alex uncovered financial records showing that Westland's stock had jumped significantly after hiring Vance, largely due to his reputation for efficiency in safety protocols. By early afternoon, they had assembled a compelling dossier of evidence, documents, testimonials, and financial records that, taken together, painted a damning picture of corporate negligence and subsequent cover-up. "This is strong," Eleanor said, as they reviewed the materials one final time before her board meeting. "Stronger than I expected we'd have so quickly." "Will it be enough?" Thomas asked. "For the board, I don't know. They're concerned about stock prices and investor confidence, not abstract justice." Eleanor gathered the most crucial documents into her briefcase. "But for the NTSB review, absolutely. This is more than enough to ensure a full reopening of the investigation." As she prepared to leave for the board meeting, Thomas walked her to her car. "Whatever happens with the board," he said, "you've done the right thing. I want you to know that." Eleanor smiled, fatigue evident beneath her composed exterior. "So have you, Thomas. After 8 years, you could have stayed in your garage, kept your head down. Instead, you chose to fight again." "I had help," he acknowledged. "You, Walter, Daniel, even Sophie in her way." "That's how the important battles are won," Eleanor replied. "Never alone." An impulse Thomas hadn't felt in years surfaced suddenly, and before he could second-guess himself, he stepped forward and embraced her briefly. "Good luck," he said as he stepped back, slightly embarrassed by the gesture. Eleanor's expression held surprise, then warm appreciation. "Thank you. I'll call you after the meeting." As her car pulled away, Thomas's phone rang again. "Walter." "You need to get home," the older man said without greeting, his voice tense. "Right now." "What's happened?" "Someone broke into your house. Police are here. Sophie's fine. She's still at school, but they've torn the place apart." Thomas was already running to his truck. "Was anything taken?" "That's the thing," Walter replied grimly. "They weren't looking to steal. They were looking for something specific. Your home office is completely ransacked, files everywhere, computer smashed. The Pinnacle documents," Thomas realized, cold dread washing through him. "I kept copies at home." "There's something else," Walter added, his voice dropping. "They left a message, spray painted on your living room wall. What does it say? We stay. Walter's reply was solemn. "Dead pilots tell no tales." "Thomas, this has gone beyond corporate politics. You need to be careful." The police had already finished their initial investigation by the time Thomas arrived home. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off his front door, and a patrol car remained parked at the curb. Walter stood on the sidewalk, his lined face grave with concern. "They're classifying it as burglary with criminal threatening," he explained, as Thomas surveyed the damage. "But this wasn't random." Thomas nodded grimly, taking in the violated space that had been his sanctuary. Drawers had been emptied onto the floor, furniture, overturned walls, dented where items had been thrown in apparent rage. The spray-painted message dominated the living room wall, its red letters dripping ominously. "Where's Sophie?" Thomas asked suddenly, grateful his daughter hadn't witnessed this violation. "With Marjorie," Walter replied, referring to his neighbor, a retired teacher who occasionally watched Sophie. "I thought it best she not see this." Thomas agreed, surveying the damage with growing anger. "This is Vance. It has to be." "Probably not directly," Walter cautioned. "Someone hired to send a message. The police said there was no sign of forced entry. They had a key or knew how to pick locks professionally." Thomas moved to his home office, where the destruction was most complete. His computer lay in pieces, the hard drive missing. The filing cabinet had been pried open, its contents scattered and torn. "They were looking for the Pinnacle documents," he confirmed, "but they're 8 years too late. Everything important is either with Eleanor or digitally backed up." Walter nodded, relieved. "Still, the message is clear." "They're escalating." Thomas's phone rang. Eleanor. "The board meeting just ended," she said without preamble. "They've suspended me pending an external review." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was expected." Her voice held resignation but not defeat. Vance called in every favor he had. The vote was 7-3 this time. "Utoi, what happens now?" "Officially, the CFO takes over while a committee investigates my judgment and decision-making. Unofficially, they'll try to separate Mitchell from the Pinnacle investigation, distance themselves from me and you." Thomas hesitated, then said, "Someone broke into my house today, looking for the Pinnacle documents." Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was audible. Are you all right, Sophie? We're fine. Sophie wasn't home and I was with you, but they left a threatening message. This is crossing lines, Eleanor said, anger replacing shock. Corporate hardball is one thing, but breaking and entering threats, that's criminal. The police are treating it as a random burglary, Thomas replied. Without proof connecting it to Vance or Westland, that's all they can do. A moment of silence followed as they both absorbed the escalating stakes. Thomas, Eleanor finally said, maybe we should take a step back. Regroup, think about Sophie's safety. That's exactly what they want, Thomas replied, resolve hardening to frighten us into silence. I know, but Eleanor, 8 years ago I walked away. I let them bury the truth because I was broken, because I couldn't fight anymore. I won't make that mistake again. After a pause, Eleanor's voice returned steadier. All right, but we need to be smarter about this, more strategic. I agree, Thomas said, starting with getting Sophie somewhere safe tonight. My place has security, Eleanor offered immediately. 24-hour doorman, restricted access elevator. Thomas considered this. Thank you, but I think Walter's would be better. Less obvious connection to either of us. Whoever did this knows where I live. They might know your address too. Good point, Eleanor conceded. What about you? I'll stay here tonight, Thomas decided. If they come back, I want to be waiting. Thomas, don't worry, I won't do anything stupid, but I won't be driven from my home either. After ending the call, Thomas turned to Walter, who had been listening to his side of the conversation. Sophie can stay with you tonight. Walter nodded firmly. Of course, Marjorie will help too. She's already offered to take Sophie for ice cream while I get the guest room ready. Thank you. Thomas clasped the older man's shoulder. For everything. Walter studied him with concern. You're really staying here after this? Thomas looked around at his violated home anger, simmering beneath his controlled exterior. They wanted to frighten me, Walter. Make me feel vulnerable, unsafe in my own house. His jaw tightened. Instead, they've just convinced me that we're getting close to something Vance desperately wants to keep hidden. Later, after Walter had left with instructions for Sophie's overnight bag and favorite stuffed animals, Thomas set about restoring order to the chaos. He worked methodically, room by room, setting furniture upright, gathering scattered belongings, sweeping up broken glass and ceramic. When he reached the living room, he stood before the spray-painted threat, studying it with cold detachment. Dead pilots tell no tales. The phrasing was odd, almost theatrical, like something from a bad movie. It lacked the clinical precision he'd expect from professional intimidation. His phone rang again, an unknown number. Reed, he answered cautiously. Mr. Reed, this is James Forrester from the NTSB. The investigator's voice was tense. I thought you should know the board has officially reopened the Pinnacle Flight 520 investigation. The announcement goes public tomorrow morning. Thomas felt a surge of vindication. That's excellent news. Yes and no, Forrester replied. The reopening is proceeding, but there's significant pressure being applied behind the scenes. I've been removed as lead investigator. Because what wife may officially potential conflict of interest due to my previous contact with you and Ms. Mitchell. Unofficially, someone wants to control the narrative. Thomas's grip tightened on the phone. Vance, I can't speculate, Forrester said carefully, but I wanted you to be prepared. This isn't over, far from it. The evidence you've provided remains in the file. It will be considered, but the process may not be as objective as we'd hoped. After thanking Forrester for the warning, Thomas returned to his cleaning with renewed determination. They had forced the investigation open. That was a victory, even if Vance was already working to undermine it from within. As evening fell, Thomas sat on his back porch with a cup of coffee, watching darkness settle over the neighborhood. His home was moderately restored, though the spray-painted message remained. He decided to leave it as a reminder of what they were dealing with. His phone chimed with a text from Walter. Sophie settled in, watching The Right Stuff, says it reminds her of you. Thomas smiled despite everything. The Right Stuff, a film about test pilots and early astronauts, men who face death daily with a combination of skill, courage, and calculating intelligence. It was one of Margaret's favorites. Another text arrived, this one from Eleanor. Board officially announced my suspension. Stock stabilized slightly. How are you holding up? He replied simply, standing firm. You. Her response came quickly, same. This isn't over. Thomas stared into the gathering darkness, feeling a strange calm descend. For 8 years, he'd lived in a kind of limbo, not moving forward, not fully processing the past. Now, despite the threats and setbacks, he felt more alive than he had since losing Margaret. He was still seated on the porch an hour later when headlights swept across the front of the house. A car pulled to the curb, not a police cruiser, but a familiar sedan. Eleanor. She approached the porch cautiously, her expression concerned as she took in the crime scene tape still draped across part of the front door. "You shouldn't be here," Thomas said, though there was no force behind the words. "Probably not," she agreed, joining him on the porch steps. "But I wanted to see for myself that you were all right." In the soft porch light with her corporate armor shed, Eleanor looked both more vulnerable and more determined than he'd seen her before. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. "They've suspended you," Thomas said. "Because of me, because of this fight." Eleanor shook her head. "Because of Vance and what he represents. The old way of doing business where profit trumps safety and accountability is for other people." She looked at him directly. "I knew the risks when I chose this path, Thomas. Just as you did." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the night sounds of the neighborhood washing over them. "Daniel called," Thomas finally said. "Two more former Pinnacle engineers have come forward with statements. Mike Zhang is organizing them into a formal group, Pinnacle Truth Coalition, they're calling it." Eleanor smiled. "The truth has a way of gathering momentum once it starts moving." "Vance must be feeling the pressure," Thomas observed. "Hence this." He gestured toward the vandalized house. "He's desperate," Eleanor agreed, "which means he's vulnerable." Thomas turned to her, struck by a sudden realization. "You know, for 8 years I thought I'd failed. Margaret failed, the passengers failed, myself. But maybe the failure was in walking away afterward and allowing myself to be silenced." "You were grieving," Eleanor said gently, "and you had Sophie to think about." "Yes, but grief can be misdirected. I poured it all into isolation, into building walls around Sophie and myself." He looked up at the night sky where stars were beginning to emerge from the darkened canvas. "Margaret wouldn't have wanted that. She believed in facing truths, however difficult." Eleanor followed his gaze upward. "She sounds remarkable." She was. Thomas turned to Eleanor, seeing her clearly in the soft light. "And she would have appreciated what you've done, risking your position, your company, for something that wasn't your fight to begin with." "It became my fight the moment I understood what was at stake," Eleanor replied simply. Thomas found himself drawing closer to her, drawn by a gravity he hadn't expected to feel again. "Eleanor," he began, but was interrupted by the sharp ring of his phone. It was Daniel Rodriguez, his voice tight with excitement. "Thomas, you need to see this. Alex found something big." "What is it?" "Not over the phone," Daniel insisted. "Can you come to the museum now?" Thomas glanced at Eleanor, who had heard enough to look intrigued. "We're on our way." The Oakland Aviation Museum was eerily still at night, its vintage aircraft casting long shadows under the security lighting. Daniel met them at a side entrance, his expression a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Sorry for the cloak and dagger," he said, as he led them through darkened exhibits toward the small office they'd used earlier. "But after what happened at your house, we thought it best to be cautious." Inside the office, Alex Chen sat hunched over his laptop, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. He looked up as they entered, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. "Show them," Daniel urged. Alex nodded, turning the laptop so they could see. "I've been digging into the financial records surrounding the Pinnacle crash insurance payouts, stock movements, executive compensation." On the screen was a complex spreadsheet tracking stock transactions in the days immediately before and after the crash. 3 days before Flight 520 went down, Alex continued, there was an unusual pattern of put options purchased against Pinnacle stock, essentially bets that the stock would fall sharply in value. "That's not uncommon," Eleanor observed. "Short sellers target vulnerable companies all the time." "Yes, but look at the volume and timing," Alex replied, highlighting several rows. These were massive positions taken just before the crash, then closed immediately after, when the stock plummeted. The profit was nearly $12 million. Thomas leaned closer, a cold suspicion forming. "Can you trace who made these trades?" That's where it gets interesting, Alex said, bringing up another document. The trades were executed through a shell company called Horizon Capital Management. It took some digging, but Horizon is owned by another entity called RSV Investments. RSV. Thomas repeated the letters, suddenly crystallizing in his mind. Robert S. Vance. Alex nodded grimly. Exactly. And here's the real bombshell. He clicked to another document. 2 weeks after these trades, RSV Investments purchased a beachfront property in the Cayman Islands for $87 million. Cash transaction. Eleanor's expression hardened. He knew. He didn't just know, Thomas said, the full implication dawning. He profited from it, directly personally profited from a crash he could have prevented. The room fell silent as they absorbed the magnitude of the discovery. This goes beyond negligence, Eleanor finally said. This is criminal. Securities fraud at minimum, possibly much worse. We need to get this to the NTSB immediately, Thomas decided. And the SEC, Forrester said he's been removed from the investigation, but he'll know who we can trust. As they prepared to leave, Thomas's phone rang again. Walter. Thomas? The older man's voice was tight with tension. Someone just tried to break into my house. Sophie's safe. We're at Marjorie's, but they're targeting us now. Thomas felt his blood run cold. Call the police. I'm on my way. Already did. But Thomas, this isn't random. They knew Sophie was here. Someone is watching us. After explaining the situation to Eleanor and Daniel, Thomas headed for the door. I'm coming with you, Eleanor insisted. No, Thomas replied firmly. If they're watching us, they may be watching you too. We shouldn't be seen together right now. Eleanor looked ready to argue, then nodded reluctantly. You're right, but Thomas, she gripped his arm, be careful. This isn't just about documents anymore. Outside, Thomas scanned the parking lot carefully before approaching his truck. The night was quiet, too quiet, perhaps the ambient sounds of the city seeming muffled and distant. As he reached for his door handle, a movement in his peripheral vision caused him to freeze. Before he could react, a sharp pain exploded at the base of his skull, and darkness swallowed him whole. His last conscious thought was of Sophie waiting for him at Marjorie's house, and of all the things he still needed to tell her about courage, about truth, about her mother's legacy that lived on in her determined little chin and fearless heart. Then nothing. Thomas awakened to the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, and when he tried to move, pain lanced down his neck and shoulders. Easy there, came Walter's familiar voice. You've got a nasty concussion. Thomas blinked his vision, gradually focusing on Walter's concerned face hovering above him. Sophie, he managed, his voice rough. She's fine, Walter assured him quickly. Eleanor's with her in the cafeteria. That woman is remarkably good with children, by the way. Relief washed through Thomas, followed immediately by confusion. What happened? You were attacked in the museum parking lot, Walter explained. Blunt force trauma to the back of the head. Eleanor found you when you didn't answer your phone. If she hadn't, he left the implication hanging. Thomas attempted to sit up, wincing at the resulting pain. How long have I been out? About 14 hours. It's just past noon. 14 hours, Thomas repeated, alarmed. The NTSB announcement happened this morning as scheduled, Walter confirmed. The investigation is officially reopened. And there's more. He picked up a tablet from the bedside table, bringing up a news site. While you were taking your unscheduled nap, the world shifted a bit. The headline read, Westland Defense Systems executive placed on leave amid allegations of securities fraud related to 2017 Pinnacle Air disaster. Alex's discovery, Thomas realized. It got out. Walter nodded. Eleanor made sure of it. When she found you unconscious, she went straight to James Forrester with everything, the financial records, the witness statements, all of it. He may have been removed from the investigation, but he still has friends at the NTSB and apparently at the SEC as well. Thomas absorbed this, a complex mixture of emotions washing through him, vindication, relief, and lingering concern. What about the break-in at your place? Prevented by your timing, Walter explained. My call to you apparently scared them off. Police found evidence of an attempted entry, but nothing was taken. The door opened, admitting Sophie, who launched herself carefully toward the bed. Dad, you're awake. Her small face was a mixture of relief and lingering worry. "Hey, kiddo," Thomas said, mustering a smile despite the pain. "Sorry to scare you." "Ms. Eleanor said you hit your head because you're stubborn," Sophie reported solemnly. "Are you going to be okay?" "I'll be fine," he assured her, glancing past her to where Eleanor stood in the doorway, her expression a complex blend of relief and something deeper. "The doctor wants to keep you for observation another day," she said, approaching the bed. "Given the severity of the concussion." Thomas nodded, wincing slightly at the movement. "Thank you for finding me, for taking care of Sophie, for everything." "Of course," Eleanor replied simply. Walter cleared his throat. "Sophie, why don't we go find that chocolate milk you wanted? Give your dad and Ms. Eleanor a minute to talk." After they left, Eleanor moved closer, taking the chair Walter had vacated. "You scared years off my life," she said quietly. "Seems to be becoming a habit," Thomas replied with a weak smile. "Finding me in mortal peril. Not a habit I'd like to continue." Her hand found his on the bed, her fingers cool against his skin. "The police are treating it as attempted murder, Thomas. They found a crowbar near where you fell. Forensics confirmed it as the weapon." Thomas absorbed this grimly. "Vance is getting desperate." "He's beyond desperate," Eleanor corrected. "The SEC has frozen his assets pending investigation. Westland's board has placed him on immediate leave. The NTSB has announced a comprehensive review of the original investigation, including allegations of evidence suppression." "It's really happening," Thomas said, a weight he'd carried for 8 years beginning to lift. "The truth is finally coming out." Eleanor squeezed his hand gently. "Yes, and there's more. Mitchell's board called an emergency session this morning after the news broke. They've reinstated me effective immediately." Thomas felt a surge of genuine happiness for her. "They recognized they were on the wrong side of history." "They recognized they were on the wrong side of public opinion," Eleanor corrected wryly, "which amounts to the same thing in corporate governance." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the beeping monitors creating a strangely intimate backdrop. "What happens now?" Thomas finally asked. "Now," Eleanor's expression softened. "Now you heal. The NTSB does its work. Justice takes its course. And us?" The question surprised Thomas as much as it seemed to surprise Eleanor. Her eyes met his, steady and clear. "That depends. Are you still running from the past, Thomas Reed? Or are you ready to build a future?" The question hung between them, laden with possibility. Before Thomas could answer, the door opened again, admitting Sophie and Walter with her promised chocolate milk. "Look what else we found," Sophie announced, holding up a newspaper. "You're on the front page, Dad and Ms. Eleanor, too." The headline read, "Justice Delayed: How an Engineer, a CEO, and a Teenage Truth Seeker Exposed One of Aviation's Darkest Cover-Ups." Beneath it was a photo of Thomas from his pinnacle days, alongside a recent picture of Eleanor at a Mitchell press conference. In smaller type was a quote attributed to Daniel Rodriguez. "This was never about blame, it was about truth. The truth my father and Mr. Reed tried to tell 8 years ago." "They're calling you heroes," Sophie said proudly, "just like I told Joey at school." Thomas glanced at Eleanor, who was watching Sophie with a warmth that touched him deeply. "Not heroes," Thomas corrected gently. "Just people who decided that the truth matters." "Isn't that what heroes do?" Sophie asked with a child's perfect logic. Thomas had no argument for that. Instead, he found himself looking at the 3 people gathered around his hospital bed. His daughter with Margaret's determined chin and fearless heart. Walter, whose steady friendship had been his anchor through the darkest days. And Eleanor, whose principled stand had helped bring light to a truth long buried. "Yes," he said finally, his gaze meeting Eleanor's. "I suppose that is what heroes do." And in that moment, Thomas Reed, engineer, father, survivor, felt the last piece of his fractured life shift into its proper alignment. Not forgetting the past, but no longer defined by it. Not alone, but surrounded by a family both old and new. Not running, but finally after 8 long years moving forward. Into clear skies.